Please welcome co-moderators Matthew Swift, co-founder, chairman, and CEO, Concordia, and Morgan Ortagus, executive director, EY, and our distinguished panel.
Up a little bit here.
All right. Well, now on to our next session. You just recently heard quite a bit about the role of big data in elections, and now we're gonna switch to actually the people out there leading the country. So, Morgan, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So the four senators that we have here, of course, need no introduction. So we decided to introduce them based off their Twitter profiles. So I'm going to start with Senator Graham to my right here. So it's interesting to us that you actually average about 9 tweets a day because you claim to not email or answer a text message. So, but you have
it's not a claim, it's true.
But according to your Twitter profile, you love Chick-fil-A. So we're dying to know, fried or grilled?
Oh, fried. Wish everything else was that easy.
The senator, of course, is also very focused on Israel and U.S. relations on Twitter recently. So we have former Senator Mitchell as well. You're probably the smartest person in the room because you don't have a Twitter profile. So we decided to look you up based off of #GeorgeMitchell, and we found some interesting things. You recently spoke at the opening of the Queen's University Belfast, where it seems that one quote stood out. "Through my experience here, I gained what I do not have, and my father never had, a sense of heritage." I don't know if you know this, but on Twitter, when people #GeorgeMitchell, it's often used alongside #listening because of your quote. "The challenge is not to get people to talk, but to get them to listen." And of course, you're also you're on the Leadership Council of Concordia. So thank you for being here, Senator Mitchell.
Thank you. And Senator Perdue, you're quite a prolific tweeter yourself. I know recently you've talked quite a bit about your concerns with the president's Iran deal, especially 1 year later. You recently participated in the 30th annual Georgia Peanut Festival in celebration of National Peanut Day, to which, fun fact, Georgia produces 57% of the country's peanuts. I did not know.
Got to be known for something.
Debt is one of your big areas of focus, and we're going to discuss that in a few minutes. You are a huge Yellow Jackets fan, and you're also a big fan of Waffle House, we found recently.
And Chick-fil-A.
And Chick-fil-A. And Senator Heitkamp, you are a huge North Dakota State fan. And I understand they had a big win the other day.
Against the
right?
Buckeyes. Hawkeyes.
Okay. And you're also very focused on human trafficking, which is an issue we've covered quite a bit here at Concordia. You also love Star Trek.
50th anniversary.
That's true.
Live long and prosper.
Yeah. So the first question to you, Senator Mitchell. I think we potentially could all agree that it is going to be very difficult for whomever gets elected president to have a mandate, to really have the country pulled together. Given all of your experiences, what would be your advice to the next president on how they get started if you don't have a mandate as president?
Well, I believe personally that the existence or absence of a mandate is highly subjective and very much overrated. Lincoln got elected with less than 40% of the vote. So did Woodrow Wilson. I think it's up to the leader, the president, to take the lead on the issues that he or she has presented in the campaign and that confront our country. And I think there's an enormous opportunity for whoever is elected president to deal with the very many issues, but let me focus on one that I think is critical that has too little discussion today. The Industrial Revolution began 250 years ago in England. The prospect of machines replacing men at work created widespread fear, anxiety, upheaval. There was some violence, there was some misery, but overall, over the century that followed, prosperity developed for the entire society because new products, new economics, new economic activity. I believe that the technological revolution through which we are now passing will be seen by historians as a turning point in human history as was the Industrial Revolution. The answer is not to turn back the clock, to try to go back to the way the world was 50 years ago, but we have to figure out how to continue to get the benefits of the technological revolution and distribute them throughout the whole society. There's been a spectacular increase in wealth in our country and in many parts of the world in the last few decades, but it is not being distributed throughout the whole societies. It is being increasingly concentrated. And there is widespread fear, anxiety, the possibility of upheaval, the possibility of violence, all exists as many, many of our fellow citizens feel they are victims, not beneficiaries of the technological revolution. We haven't addressed that as a society as a whole, and it can only be addressed by the society as a whole, and that society can only be brought together by a president who fully understands the challenge and who is committed to resolving it in a way that is fair, equitable, that promotes economic growth and wealth creation, but also does so in a way that will help to see that the disadvantages are mitigated and the prosperity is spread through the whole society.
Thank you. Senator Graham, you ran for president this year against
Finished
Mr.
in
Trump.
the top 17 on it.
So everybody wants to know about Trump, and is he an aberration to this party, or is the Trump agenda here to stay? And more so, what do you expect from the Republican Party if he wins and if he loses?
Well, Trump, he had a base in a 17-person primary. If you can get 25 or 30% of the people, you can go a very long way. So how did he do that? He got to everybody's right on immigration. It was sort of fun to see him to make Ted Cruz a rhino. Ted was an establishment guy when this thing was all over with. So the bottom line is he took a position on immigration that resonates with about 25 or 30% of our base. All of them have to go. He and Bernie now have made trade a bad thing for the American worker. So between immigration and banning all Muslims, that was had a lot of resonance in certain areas of our primary. He was able to get a foothold. He did very well at the debates. He eventually outlasted everybody, and we are where we are. If he wins, what does it mean? Well, it means that everything we believe on trade has been turned upside down. It means that immigration solutions that I've been pursuing for a decade apparently were rejected by the American people. And I don't see any Democrat agreeing to deport 11 million people, including their U.S.-born children. So if he wins, it really changes the party's position on some of its fundamental issues like national security, like trade, and what President Bush tried to do in immigration. If he loses, it means that if we don't correct fairly soon, we're probably going to be denied growing the vote with Hispanics for a very long time. Because in 2012, we did a post-mortem on the election. We had a problem with Hispanics and young women. I think Mr. Trump's position on immigration has made our problem with Hispanics worse. And if he does win, it'll be because he got a lot of disaffected white working-class Democrats to vote for him out of anger. It'll be kind of like Pete Wilson. You won the battle, but you probably lost the war.
Yeah. Senator Perdue, Concordia focuses on public-private partnerships, and you probably more than just about any other speaker at Concordia represent both sectors incredibly well. Can you talk a little bit about how you use your private sector experience in the Senate today?
Well, it's not hard. There are so few of us that have any business background or business acumen in the Senate, especially. There's only one Fortune 500 CEO in all of Congress, and he's from Georgia. But I actually think we've got some models out here in the world that give us the way forward. And I agree with Senator Mitchell. I think, honestly, we shouldn't look back. We are on the cusp, I think, of a 50 or 75-year period of time that if we do the right things in the next 4 to 5 years, we could set the world up for the next great economic boom. And the way out of an industrial revolution into an information economy is a transition. And to do that, you have to have leadership, and America's in that position to lead right now. And I honestly think that it starts in the White House. But this public-private partnership has models out there that prove that it's the way forward. Look at Power Africa right now. $7 billion of federal money, U.S. money, attracted $43 billion. And they're going to bring power to much of Africa. Well, that's over $50 billion there, but let me give you a slight downside to this whole thing, and that is that unless the public side of that gets its act together, it won't be able to help. And here's why. $50 billion is a big number in the federal government. The quarter-point increase in the Fed rate just last year in December is $50 billion of new interest. $50 billion. Imagine what that could do. If interest rates were at their 30-year average of just 5%, we'd be paying, over $1 trillion in interest. So this public-private partnership is a way forward because a lot of the equity that goes into those, that attracts capital, is best used coming from the private sector. And after all, who knows more about consumers than the successful private companies? I would argue that that's kind of what's going on in this election in some degree, is that these insiders, the people in the establishment, are having a hard time understanding this movement that's out here because they haven't been listening. The people on the outside, the business community, have a better perspective on that, I think, than the people in Washington.
Thank you. Senator Heitkamp, one of the things that we're consistently hearing from voters is that Washington is broken and the systems seem to be broken. Something that I thought that we could all come together on was funding for Zika. And it was amazing to me that the Congress left in August and took a month off when we really have a health epidemic as it relates to Zika. Can you, and I think you're going to have some progress hopefully this week on the Zika funding bill, but can you tell us, whenever our Congress can't come together to solve emergency health crises, is there any hope for the future? What can young people look to the Senate to actually get done?
Well, I think what you're hearing from almost every person on this panel is that we need to articulate a future for this country. We live in 2-year, 6-year increments, 4-year increments when we're looking at state politics, and no one looks up. I say, we're going to look up. We're going to look 20 years into the future, and what does that look like? And the big challenge right now is convincing people that they're in a global economy, they're going to stay in a global economy, and we need to prepare for a global economy. And this campaign isn't doing what it needs to do to bring people along and explain what the circumstances are. And I think as a result, what happens is you have a void where leadership, and I'll be critical on both sides, where leadership looks at what is the best 20-second or 10-second soundbite that's going to motivate a base rather than leading the people towards an agenda and having legitimate debate. I think it's fueled, number one, by the hyper-partisanship of campaigns, whether it is, we're protecting Planned Parenthood or we're after Planned Parenthood, which has gotten wrapped up into this whole Zika mess. But you look at almost every major issue, we've been tied up by a small little issue that is not even related many times. And so what I always like to say is that we ought to have a new rule in the Senate, because you can only get something done in the Senate if you do one of two things. Number one, have a long debate on a bill where it's open for Senate debate, or you get unanimous consent. What does that mean? It means one person can stop what needs to be done. And Lindsey and I have been working on a one person stopping what needs to be done for helping the American economy on the XM Bank. So what should we do? Maybe what we should do is have another rule that if you can get 2/3 of your colleagues to agree to take a vote up or down on something, that we have a special spot on the calendar. Why is that important? It's important that the people of this country see us making decisions, see the rationality that's happening in the United States Congress, smart people. And instead what they see is kind of a kindergarten behavior where you're whacking each other over the head on things that don't seem to be relate. And as a result, we've lost the public confidence. We need to get that public confidence back. But if we're looking at what needs to happen in the future, we need to have dynamic leadership that points to a place on the horizon, not just 2 years from now or 4 years from now or 6 years from now, but what's this economy going to look like on the horizon, and how are we going to get there, and how is everybody going to benefit from that economic growth? And I think the real challenge here is transcending very hyper-partisan politics to get to the debate. And that's why we ran. I think that's why David ran. That's why I ran. We didn't come here to argue about things that in the long run we can't get things done. We came here to be part of an agenda and a discussion about the future of this country. And you're going to frustrate people and people are going to leave because what we signed up for is not what we're getting.
So let's get to the bottom of this, because at this summit, we have 63 countries represented. And I think the majority of people coming from overseas have two general questions. One, what's going on with Donald Trump? And then two is, why are things not working? And so a quick sort of lightning round question to you all. Is this, in your opinion, the most partisan environment that you have ever seen in American politics? Starting with you, Senator Mitchell.
That I've ever seen personally?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, of course, by far.
I'm new to Washington, but this isn't how we do it in North Dakota.
It's bad, and it won't change until you get a new president that can get the American people to listen and get American members of Congress to listen and work with them.
Well, I'm new to this, so I can give you an outsider's perspective, but it's awful. I actually ran an ad when I started that had 435 babies in diapers on the lawn of the Capitol, and basically said, isn't it time for an adult in the room? And I agree with Senator Heitkamp that you know, our problem here is not that one side's right or the other side's wrong. If that were the case, we would have you know, a different leadership. But I actually think it's the gridlock up there. There are good ideas all around, and the problem is we can't get to it because of the net sum game of trying to divide up 100 marbles in the United States Senate. And if we can get past that, the opportunities are out there. I mean, I go back to Senator Mitchell. I mean, this potential is real, and the world needs us to lead. We were talking backstage. You know, you talk to people outside the country. I'm on foreign relations, and we've traveled a lot this year, and I know everybody on the stage travels a lot. The number one thing that I've gotten from heads of state is America needs to lead again. We don't need you to be the policeman for the world, but we need you to lead again. We need somebody to help us move to some of these solutions that are so necessary out there in the world today.
But can we get to the bottom of this though again? But what is the cause of this partisanship? Is it campaign finance? Is it redistricting? Is it where would you identify the single biggest issue that's causing this? Is it lack of term limits? I don't know.
Well, honestly, it didn't just start with this Congress. If you go back and read the founders, I mean, they weren't bosom buddies either. Yeah. I mean, this is going on. This is democracy. You know, Robespierre had a pretty tough time in their little revolution over there as well. So I mean, I look at what's going on now. This is part of democracy. It's messy. It's difficult, but so is business. It's all about survival. The problem is that Americans don't always recognize when we're in a crisis as early as we should. Once we do, we're the best at dealing with it in history, in my opinion. And that's where we are. I think Senator Mitchell's on it. If we could recognize that we have that problem, I think we'd be shoulder to shoulder and we'd break through the barriers that Senator Heitkamp talks about.
Well, I agree with you that campaign finance is a huge factor. Redistricting is a huge factor. Technology is neutral. We derive enormous benefits from it, but technology can be used for wrongful purposes as well. And it has enabled a degree of partisanship in redistricting that is really without precedent in our history. And each 10 years, it gets worse because the technology gets better. So those are factors. But I want to say it doesn't have to be this way. When I was elected majority leader by the Senate Democrats, the first person I called was Bob Dole, who was the Republican leader. And I went to see him. I said to him, look, you've been here 25 years. I've only been here a couple of years. You know a lot more than I do, but I've been here long enough to know that if the two leaders don't trust each other, the Senate can't function. And so I suggested to him how I would behave toward him and the most basic standards of fairness and openness and decency. He was delighted. We shook hands. And to this moment, never once has a harsh word ever passed between Bob Dole and me. We disagreed almost every day on almost every issue. And we negotiated long and hard. When we couldn't agree, we left it to the Senate to decide. And we debated very vigorously, but we never made it personal. And we never tried to embarrass the other, because we recognized that while we had an obligation of loyalty to the senators who elected us, me to the Democrats, he to the Republicans, we had a higher loyalty to the people of this country. And it is a misplacement of priorities that's going on now in our society, where the highest value, the highest loyalty is to the party and to the position, not to the people of this country.
Well, the good old days. So we're living in the good old days. Somebody referred to us one time down the futures, how well we got along. The bottom line is, I think it's mostly fear of losing.
Yep.
Every bill is a jobs bill, a sure job. So when you go to the House, I can't think of one, maybe two, Republicans who depend on minority votes in a primary. So when you talk about immigration and you talk about issues that are more broad, most people in the House, in your state and mine, are afraid of crossing talk radio and some of these groups to get a primary because they'll call you Lindsey Grahamnesty. Your day is coming. I like Heidi because she does try to find the middle. The Bernie agenda, let's say, will be unfulfilled by 2020. No matter who's president, we're not going to have a $15 an hour minimum wage, and college is not going to be free, and there's not going to be a single payer system, and people are going to be pissed. And what's going to happen is that there's going to be an inter-party breakdown on the Democratic side, like you've seen on the Republican side, where you'll see more and more primaries. Debbie Wasserman Schultz is the canary in the coal mine. So really, it's going to get worse before it gets better. And here's how I think it eventually gets better. The problems become so real that you can't ignore them. The consequences of doing nothing overshadow moving forward, even if there's a little pain involved. So here's what I think will happen. I think the next president of the United States has a unique opportunity in 27 to bust out. I think the country's dying to be led. You got about a year. We've done immigration every way you could do it. If they gave tattoos for being in a gang, I'd have an armful. We'll secure our border, we'll control who gets a job, we'll have a national e-verify system, but we will not deport 11 million illegal immigrants. Crooks and troublemakers, yes, grandmothers, no. And we'll have a merit-based immigration system to replace a family-based immigration system. That will pass the Senate, guys. If it dies in the House because everybody's afraid to embrace something that will be called amnesty, then you might as well not run in 2020 as Republican, because you'll reinforce the narrative with Hispanics for yet another generation. So from my point of view, the test of the Republican Party eventually is, can you get immigration off the table? Can you get House members to look their constituents in the eye and say, I know you're frustrated, I know you're upset, but I can't give you what you're wanting, to deport 11 million people. We got to be practical. And I'll end on this. Somebody better deal with the debt. To my friend Bernie, you're full of crap when you say you don't have to adjust Medicare or Social Security age of retirement and means test. There's not enough money among the rich to solve the problem. If you took the entire wealth of the 1%, which is $30 trillion, and their dogs, that's half of what you need to close the $70 trillion gap. And to my Republican friends, you're not going to grow this economy fast enough under the supply side not to deal with the fact that you've got to adjust the age of retirement, means test benefits, and do revenue. So here it is. If you're not willing to do revenue as a Republican, you'll never get a Democrat to the dance to adjust the age of retirement, means test benefits. And if you're not willing to do the things on entitlement, we're not going to give you any revenue.
What are you looking at me for?
Because I think you'll do both.
I think the challenge here is motivation. You know, why have you come here? Have you come here to fill up a seat that gives one side or the other the power to set the agenda, or have you come to set the agenda for the country? And, you know, I come from a state, probably, you know, there's a lot of folks here who are pretty comfortable in their political party. I come from a state that Obama lost by 22 points and I won. And the message was simple. We need to solve problems in this country. And it needs to be bigger than a political party. It needs to be bigger than that individual in that seat. And if you can't work together, then you need to get out. If you can't figure out how to work together, then you don't belong in the United States Senate and you don't belong in the United States Congress. If it's your way or the highway, you need to get out. How do we get people out? Voters have to vote them out. And so we have to start leading by talking about agendas and not talking in sound bites. You take a look at Mr. Trump's campaign. I think the most interesting thing about his campaign is what he was able to do without spending a lot of money. There will come a point where we talk about campaign finance reform. What I challenge young people when they come to my office is I say, figure out a way to win without spending a lot of money. You have unprecedented access to people, and it doesn't have to be on television, on the nightly news. Guess what? Everybody under 50 isn't watching the nightly news anymore. And so what's the opportunity to kind of change the way we do campaigns because I don't think we see Citizens United going away anytime soon. How do we provide leadership to the country by talking about what we're going to do and not talking about what somebody else did? And that's the challenge, and that's why the American people are so frustrated with, I think, the Congress, because it is all about inside the Beltway, kind of nitpicking, and not about the greater interests of this country, both economically and socially.
Let's liven this thing up a little bit. So if David and I said, we will close some tax hole deductions and loopholes, we will generate some revenue by cleaning up the tax code, applying some of that revenue stream to the debt, like Simpson Bowles, do you think you could get 30 votes on your side to adjust the age of retirement for Medicare and Social Security means test benefits?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. And if you look at what's so fascinating about it is everybody talks about Social Security. Social Security is not the looming threat on the budget. You already heard Senator Perdue talk about what 0.25% means. We have a deficit that's inching its way up to 20 trillion. That's where we come up with this number. It is inching its way up to being, equal to the gross domestic product of this country every year. 1% is a huge hit to our economy. It's a huge hit to the budget. And so, but where's the big looming problem? It's in healthcare. If you took a look at that big chart where you see what's happening with the challenges, it's healthcare. So the bigger challenge for me is how do you look at healthcare, bend the curve, talk about what we're going to do to provide greater and more affordable services to the older. North Dakota is the second behind Rhode Island in the number of people, percentage of our population over 85. Think about what that means. Think about what that means to the deficit and debt. And at some point, what I've said for years, Noah, for the last 4 years almost that I've been in Washington, I say Washington is a fact-deficient place. People don't want to talk about facts. They don't want to talk facts should be nonpartisan. And let me tell you, we've got some facts that ought to scare the hell out of us in terms of where we're headed with debt and deficit, where we're headed with the growth of healthcare. And if we don't put every potential solution on the table, I think we will have failed the American public to actually have a dialogue that's going to achieve a result.
Can I have your baby? Seriously, this is, I am so excited about this conversation because here's the I honestly
believe.
That's
bipartisan, I think.
Yeah, right. I can't give it any more than that. So, I'm known as sort of the debt hawk, but I'm also a defense hawk at the same time. But here's this moment of national emergency, I believe. It's not just about interest rates. It's about how people are hurting, and we're losing the ability from this country to help the world and to help our own people. That's what you hear in this presidential election, frankly, is that people are scared, and they should be, because people out there in America know what people in the rest of the world already know. We have $60 trillion of sovereign debt. Matt and Morgan just wrote a great piece on this, that we have over $100 trillion of future commitments by this government, both Democrat and Republican, over the last 100 years. It's all coming home to roost. And the millennials are the ones that are going to have to deal with over the next 30 years. This is a real crisis, and they are beginning to pick up on that. But here's the problem. We have such an opportunity. We're not focused on that. I've been here a year and a half in the United States Senate. We haven't really done anything to deal with Social Security or Medicare, Medicaid. And Heidi's right. The curve just explodes off the chart with Medicare and Medicaid over the next 20 years, such that the liability of American debt, not only is it a third of total debt in the world, corporate or sovereign debt, but it is $1 million for every family in America. 1 million, and that's where we are. And yet the opportunities abound if we would break through the gridlock, not only get the economy going, economy alone is not going to do it, but we have redundant agencies, we have a budget process that's not worked but 4 times in 40 years. It doesn't fund the government. We end up having these CR, continuing resolutions like we have now, and an omnibus where 8 people get in a room and honestly deal with how to spend $1 trillion. And worst of that is we spend upwards of $4 trillion running the federal government. We only talk about $1 trillion of that in the federal budget. That's wrong, and we can fix that. But if we don't get after Social Security and Medicare and save them, those trust funds go to zero in 15 short years. And the last one is the spiraling nature of healthcare. I couldn't agree more. But you know, we spend $34 trillion on medical research in the NIH, 34. We just spent $50 billion in new interest with this quarter-point interest rate rise. We're kidding ourselves. We're losing the ability to deal with these problems, even if we could break through the gridlock. But that's our number one crisis.
And if I just want to add something. If we quit thinking about whether we're going to be a hero in 2 years and think about how people are going to look at us in 20 years, and if that's the motivating factor, guess what? I think we can get it done. Because people are not stupid in the United States Senate. I mean, we're not the smartest people there telling you this. Everybody who actually has looked at this knows that this is a huge problem. The question is, can I wait until the next cycle to deal with it? That's why we've got to get out of this mindset that, I mean, I think when people say it's about term limits, guess what? Well over half of the United States Senate has only been there 8 years.
Wow.
But the other half's been there more than 20 years. Just saying.
We're going to switch to foreign policy now. As you all know, we were attacked again in New York this weekend, in New Jersey, and Minnesota. We're lucky to have Senator Mitchell, who was President Obama's Middle East envoy, and of course Senator Graham, who was in the Air Force for 33 years and sits on armed services. Something that I was thinking about this weekend when I saw the attack again, if you're an 18-year-old college freshman, you were born probably at the end of the Clinton administration, so you have no recollection of that. You were probably around 3 years old if you're a college freshman when 9/11 happened, so you probably don't really have a vivid memory of that as well. So 15 years later, in 2016, can you tell 18-year-old voters that are going to be voting for the first time, why are we still fighting?
Well, I have an 18-year-old son who just entered college. And when he permits me to talk to him, the world has always been a dangerous place. It is a myth today that it is more dangerous than ever before. In fact, by the most important metric of all, human death, the world's much safer than it ever was. In the 20th century, in just the 2 world wars, in a world in which the population was between a third and a half of what it is today, 78 million people died. It's going to be turbulent for the next several decades. There's no avoiding that. There's no policy or action that can prevent that. 1 in 5 people on Earth today is Muslim. That's 1.5 billion out of 7.5 billion. By 2060, when the population approaches 10 billion worldwide, 1 in 3 will be Muslim. That's 3.5 billion. To put that into perspective, that was the total population of the world as recently as 1970. And Islam is going through a period of internal strife. There has been a Sunni-Shia split for 1,400 years since the beginning. Interestingly, it was not, at its origin, a religious difference. It was a struggle for political control between 2 groups, and the prevailing group became the Sunni. The losing group became the Shia. And it was an example of how, while there are religious differences in the world, they are most often exploited by political leaders seeking to gain or retain power and encouraging the divisions for their own political benefit. Now, There are many intersecting, overlapping, some contradictory conflicts within Islam. But there is the notion that there is a single policy or a single act which is going to suddenly end any of this turbulence is a fantasy. We have an important role to play as the world's dominant power, and we will be the dominant power for as far into the future as human beings can see. We have by far the strongest economy. We have overwhelmingly the most powerful military force ever assembled on the face of the earth. And we will be involved because we, unique among the nations of the world, have relations with almost every country in the world, including countries which are themselves in opposition, indeed at war with each other. We have to do the best we can to resist the dark forces, that portion of Islamic extremism which seeks to distort the religion and impose an archaic version of Islam upon their people and others. And we have to keep in mind, and the tragedies here are tragedies, but the reality is that the overwhelming majority of people killed through terrorist acts in recent decades are Muslims, living in Muslim countries, killed by other Muslims. We have to do what we can to help, support, and encourage those who share the universal values that we espouse. But we must rid ourselves of the notion that there is a single act or policy or a single military action that is going to somehow bring this to close. Most people in this country are Christians, and Christianity went through an intense and long period of turmoil in which the number of deaths on a per capita basis far exceeded anything which is occurring today. So I think we are the leaders. We have a role to play, but we cannot control all of the events that occur in the region. And we have to do our highest duty to protect our own people here and elsewhere.
Senator Graham.
Well, I tell the 18-year-old the reason we're still at war is they keep fighting. It takes two to quit. And I would tell them we're going to win. It's just going to take a while. Because most 18-year-olds over there don't want to live under ISIL any more than you do. Very few fathers and mothers actually want to turn their 18-year-old daughter over to ISIL. I've been to Iraq and Afghanistan 38 times. Here's the good news. They're not buying what Al-Qaeda and ISIL is selling. They just need our help. And I'm a little frustrated, as you can tell. If you're not willing to adjust the age of retirement for Medicare, harmonizing it with Social Security, we're never going to get there. And if I'll do revenue, but there's no magic answer here, people are going to have to give, and they're going to have to give a little bit where it hurts. If you say there's no troops in Iraq and Syria, U.S. troops, then you get ready for another 9/11 because it's coming. Here's a good question. If the Iraqis ask us to leave some troops behind this time, would we? Here's the way you win the war. Has anyone ever described what winning looks like? You know, you take Berlin, you take Tokyo, that's winning. This is a war of ideology. Winning to me is when the people over there can fight back without a bunch of us being there to do the fighting for them. When the imams can preach against the ideology and not get killed. When the cop and the judge are fair to the people, not the dictator or not some radical ideology. In other words, if you want to win this war, you got to invest in the lives of others. You better be willing to build a small schoolhouse for a poor young girl to give her a say about her children, as well as drop a bomb. And when you drop the bomb, if you're not willing to stay, you're not going to win. Now, here's what I would do if I were the next president, which I'm not going to be. I would describe what winning looks like and tell people it's going to take a while, but we can get there. But there's going to be some requirement for military force in partnership with others. That we're going to have to get engaged in the lives of others. Even though we're broke here, we're going to have to help them over there, or you'll never win this war. And we got to be patient. And we got to hit them before they hit us. And how do you win? You educate poor young girls. You create institutions loyal to the people, not the dictator or the radical Islamic movement. We will win. The only question is how many people will die before we get there. And you mentioned 78 million, George. My biggest fear above all others is before we win, there'll be a marriage of radical Islam nation state or terrorist group and a weapon of mass destruction. I've never been more worried about that marriage than I am right now.
Can we shift a little bit? I want to talk, and I want to get everybody on the panel's opinion. Tomorrow, we're hosting the Private Sector Forum on Refugees in partnership with UNHCR and Columbia University. What should the U.S.'s involvement be addressing the refugee crisis? Why don't we start with you, Senator Heitkamp?
I want to start with an area that you may not be thinking about, which is the triangle countries, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. We watch the unaccompanied minors moving north to our border, trying to get through, riding death trains. I mean, this is a horrible thing that's happening. It's a horrible humanitarian crisis. What people don't understand is Belize and Mexico to some extent, Costa Rica, Nicaragua are all hosting refugees. These are, in fact, people fleeing these countries because of gang warfare, because these are not economic refugees. These are refugees leaving because they fear for their lives. When you look at our role in refugees and you think about kind of where it's in our national interest to support communities, whether it's Belize, whether it's Nicaragua, whether it's Costa Rica, support those communities so people can stay in the region while we're attempting through the efforts that Lindsey just outlined, looking at growing economies, looking at making sure that we're helping stabilize, making sure that our investments are well placed in those three countries, stabilize that area. And so I think that people see the refugee crisis as something that's coming at us and not something that should be managed. And I think that when we look at refugees, we can't just look at what's happening out of Syria. We can't just look at what's happening out of Libya. We've got to be looking even in our own hemisphere. And we've got to have better and I think greater public support for playing a very active role in how we work with the UN, how we work with the communities that are dealing with the refugee crisis. And the most important thing we can do is basically say it is in our best interest to be part of the international dialogue on refugees and refugee resettlement. Because if we don't, it's going to exacerbate the situation and lead to further unrest.
So I hear that, and I wanted to ask Senator Perdue and Senator Graham about this. What do we do about Venezuela?
Well, before
How should we be engaged?
Yeah, but well, you got a bad guy there, and he's got to go. We have such potential in Venezuela, but I want to finish the dialogue on refugees, if I may. Yeah. Because this is one of the facets of this global security crisis that we have right now that we're feeling. We have a generation, maybe two, of disenfranchised young people. Lindsey and I were in Gaziantep, in a refugee camp on the border of Syria and Turkey, and we saw 4-year-olds that were born in the camp. There's every likelihood that those 4-year-olds will graduate from high school and never know anything else but that camp. And those are the lucky ones. Those are the 10% in camps. I mean, there are 3 million refugees in Turkey alone, only 300,000 in camps. And in Egypt, we visited with President el-Sisi, and they don't have anywhere near that percentage. I mean, this is a global disaster. 65 million people have been displaced on the face of the earth, and we don't really talk about that enough. And the solution is not going to be out of our hip pocket. $34 trillion is what the United States gives in U.S. aid. And that's a drop in the bucket compared to what is needed. Saudi Arabia, the Persian Gulf states, China, Russia. I mean, we've got to form a new Marshall Plan, if you will, to get at providing a place for these people to go home. If you stop the fighting in Syria today, you haven't solved the problem because you got a generation of people that have nothing to go home to. We met families in Kosovo and Serbia in the refugee pipeline going to Germany. I've talked to General Breedlove. General Breedlove believes that the refugees have been weaponized by Putin in Eastern Europe. This is a crisis that's adding to the instability around the world. Venezuela is an economic miracle waiting to happen with their energy and so forth. And it ties in with our strategic interests long term. But we've got a bad guy that's got to go. We've got free elections that need to be put in there, and democracy needs to abound. But honestly, we have not had a definitive policy there relative to the bad guys who are still in control.
Senator Graham, shouldn't we be paying more attention to our own hemisphere?
Well, sure. I mean, like Plan Colombia worked. Looks like they're going to reconcile with the FARC. I've been to Colombia a few times. That would be great. That part of the world has gone through experimentation with socialism. Hasn't worked too well. So yeah, we need to be paying attention to all parts of the world. Here at home, the TPP, anybody want to pay attention to Asia? If we don't pass the TPP, The countries in question believe we have completely abandoned them. I just got back from Singapore. They're apoplectic about the idea that we're going to pull the rug out from under them this close after all these negotiations, and China's licking their chops. Same type dynamic down below us. Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, we're spending $750 million at Joe Biden's request to try to stabilize that part of Central and Latin America so that the refugee problem will be abated somewhat. The energy cost in these three countries is exorbitantly high because there's one gas pipeline. We're trying to build another. So yes, investing in the lives of others is the ultimate way out. We are in debt. We need to do it in partnership. But let me just remind this. On September the 10th, 2001, we didn't have one soldier in Afghanistan. We didn't have an embassy. And they didn't receive a dime of aid. There's a fight in the heart and soul of the Republican Party between isolationism and leading like Ronald Reagan. David Perdue has been a godsend in so many different ways. He travels, he learns, he's got political courage, he understands why he's here. This infection of isolationism is moving over to the Democratic Party. So here's what I fear the most, guys. That as we retreat on multiple fronts, all of these vacuums are being filled by some pretty unsavory characters. Where do we need to get right first? Syria. Syria is the cancer of the Mideast. 1 in 5 Lebanese children are Syrian refugees. Jordan is hanging by a thread. When Obama drew the red line and Assad crossed it, China, Russia, Iran, the rest is history. So the next president of the United States is going to have an enormous challenge in Syria, putting that place back together. So I hope all of us who are in the Senate, and George, I hope you'll help where you can, to come up with a policy that will stabilize Syria before it takes the whole Mideast down with it.
So Syrian policy is our next question. Go ahead, Senator.
Could I say a word about the broader subject of immigration, which includes the question of refugees?
Yes.
Everybody in this room, everybody in America came here from somewhere else. Everybody. Even the Native Americans. They came 15,000 years earlier, but they came from Asia across what is now the Bering Strait. And from the very beginning of European colonization, about 500 years ago, groups were set against groups. Demonization and guilt by association started with the European colonization. The Dutch, the British, the French, the Spanish struggled for control of North America, and they did so in part by fighting the others. Everybody here knows the words Wall Street. Where does it come from? How's it so famous? Well, it's a small street not far from here where the Dutch built a wall. Not to keep out the Native Americans, but to keep out who they really feared, the English. And demonization of incoming groups is a part of our history. There's nothing new about anything that Mr. Trump is saying today, or those who support him. We needed people, so for 100 years, we were a country of open immigration. The first Anti-Immigration Act passed in 1882 to keep out the Chinese because some of them came to help build the Intercontinental Railroad. In 1906, a huge earthquake devastated San Francisco. They didn't know what to do about all the school children because the schools were devastated, so they decided to shrink the school population by passing an ordinance which prohibited any child of Japanese ancestry, even one born in America, from entering the public schools. And the Irish, the Italians, the Jews, the Catholics, everyone experienced intense hostility, demonization, guilt by association. The Ku Klux Klan started as an anti-African American group in the South, but reached its peak in the 1920s in the North and Midwest as an anti-Catholic, anti-Semitic group. Stoking fear, encouraging division and hatred is part of our history, but we've always risen above it. And we have benefited from that. enormously. The three most successful business enterprises in our country today, and arguably in the world, are Apple, Amazon, and Google. Apple was created by Steve Jobs, whose father was born in Syria. Amazon was created by Jeff Bezos, whose adoptive father was born in Cuba. And the co-founder of Google was Sergey Brin, who himself was born in Russia. So I ask you to ponder two rhetorical questions. First, would this be a better country if they had not been admitted? And secondly, what do you think the chances are that Steve Jobs would have created Apple had he lived his life in Damascus, or Jeff Bezos in Havana, or Sergey Brin in Russia? Genius knows no language, no ethnicity, no religion. It can be found anywhere, but it needs a place of freedom and opportunity to enable it to flourish. And that's what this country has done, and we have benefited enormously from it. And the greatness of America is these three stories. These three stories are just the tip of the iceberg. Every one of us knows people in every city that have come here and done well from the most modest and humble of beginnings. And now no rational person, no rational American thinks that we can go back to the days when anybody could come here that wanted to come. That's a practical, political, economic impossibility. So what we need is a fair and rational way to decide who will come. And right now, the whole debate is about how do we keep them out, when we should be at least including in the discussion, how can we attract those who can contribute most to our society, and how can we meet our historic role, symbolized by the Statue of Liberty, which is to serve as a beacon, a place of freedom and opportunity for the oppressed and the downtrodden everywhere. Well, we can't take everyone, but we sure can take a lot, as we have in the past and as we will in the future. And one of the reasons America is going to be the dominant country for the next half century is because it's the fastest growing, large, developed country in the world. We're going from 320 million today to 440 million by 2050, just 36 years ago, due primarily to immigration. And we have to figure out the way to get the maximum benefit as a society by giving the maximum opportunity to those who can contribute so much to our society. And appeals to division, hatred, bigotry, and racism are obstacles along the way, but they're not new obstacles. We've conquered them in the past, and I believe we can in the future as well.
Who's clapping? How many of you would support 100,000 Syrian refugees coming in 2017? How many votes would that get in the United States Senate?
I think the point here is that we don't have a point of leadership in this country that has defined what it is that we're going to do. And, you know, you talk about TPP and the insecurity that globalization has created. Let me tell you, young people see it differently. And I tell young people, look, you know, 95% of all potential consumers in the world, you know, we consume above our weight in the United States, but 95% of all potential consumers in the world do not live in this country. If you are not thinking globally, you are going to be economically unsuccessful. And that's the reality. And so we treat people like, just trust us. We're from Washington, just trust us. We're going to give you TPP and you're going to like it. Well, we need to bring people along, and all of these issues, we need to expect that people are going to understand when we have the courage as public leaders to stand up and explain the challenges ahead. And that's the piece we're missing. The political courage to actually talk about what's really going on in the world, what's going on in this country, and to trust people the American people in this great democracy to work with us to achieve the solution. And that leadership is non-existent, in my opinion, in today's political climate.
So I think that we're getting ready to close, and we're going to have an exercise here with the senators and make them answer our final question in one word, which we know how much they like to do. So over the weekend, Senator Tim Kaine got in a little bit of trouble. He's Hillary Clinton's running mate because he, a few years ago, called President Obama's Syrian policy a joke. So starting with Senator Perdue, can you describe in one word how what you think of President Obama's policy as it relates to Syria?
Ludicrous.
Disaster.
Challenged.
Serious mistakes.
That's 2 words.
And on that very happy note, thank you, everybody.